Hey friends, even if you've followed my channel for a while, you might not know that Warframe is one of my favorite games. After all, I don't mention it a whole lot outside of my first two videos, channel name, profile picture, background, and outro music, but I have played just a bit of it. And years ago, a friend of mine challenged me to answer this very question, and even at the time, it took some work. But since then, two major things have happened. The game's build system has become much more complicated, and I started a YouTube channel. So now seems like a good time to try it again. Fair warning, I do a lot of math on this channel, it's pretty much all I do, but this video is going to cover topics a little deeper and more advanced than anything I've posted before, like set theory and combinatorics. I've also never seen anyone else cover topics like it in this vague YouTube space about analyzing video games with math and science. Which is weird because both of those fields are super useful, and I think they're pretty cool, but because of that, I don't know if anyone's really interested in content like this. So, if you enjoy it, make sure to let me know by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and all that other algorithm stuff. Also, for the record, I'll try and make sure you don't have to be too familiar with the game to follow along, especially since some of the stuff I'll talk about is either kind of obscure or only available late game. All that said, let's figure out how many builds are possible in Warframe. Before we get into it, let me explain that asterisk. First of all, as of the writing of this video, the most current version of the game is Update 39. That means the newest Warframe is Oraxia, and the newest Prime Warframe is Ureli. Damn, really? If either of those are no longer true, or if DE adds more mods or something, the numbers in this video will no longer be accurate. Second of all, right now I'm only going to be handling the builds of Warframes themselves. If you watch to the end, I hope you'll understand why. If this video does well though, I will try and do a part 2 with like weapons and stuff. Speaking of things that I won't be covering, way back when I was originally handling this problem, I had to survey a lot of people to figure out what does count as a different build, because not everyone agreed on that. So here are my ground rules. Fashion doesn't count, usually. More on that later. I also won't count different levels of mods and arcanes as different builds, even though there are some niche cases where you might want an underleveled mod. And, in the same vein, despite a single absolute psychopath thinking otherwise, I also don't think the level of the Warframe counts, even if abilities technically change as you level. Forma, in its various forms, might count, but I'm gonna ignore them and the Organ reactors since they enable builds to be possible rather than being part of the builds. And finally, like I said before, in this video I won't handle weapons, companions, operators, or anything else that isn't either a Warframe or equipped on a Warframe. That leaves us with this list, and instead of starting with anything that makes sense, I'm going to start with focus lenses, since they are by far the simplest. These don't directly affect how your Warframe plays, instead they just collect points for a skill tree that's part of the stuff I'm not including, but they do still have a mechanical impact, and are equipped directly onto the Warframe, so they fit my rule set. You get one of them, they come in 4 tiers, each with 5 options, meaning there are 20 total focus lenses, with the additional option of not having one, for 21 total builds using just these. Next, we can start on what most people probably think of first when discussing builds in Warframe: mods. They offer the most choices, make the biggest impact on your gameplay mechanically, and come in a few different types. Let's start with the aura mods, because unlike most things that have to do with modding, which are very complex and interconnected, auras are entirely separate. What they do isn't super important to this video, but what is important is that they can't go anywhere else, nothing else can go here, there's a pretty small pool of them, and there's only one special exception. Most Warframes can only have one aura, and there are 36 of them, meaning, including the blank, there are 37 different options. But Jade can equip 2 of them, and importantly, they can't be the same one. You might think that means the total number of combinations for her is 37 for one slot times 36 for the other, but keep in mind that this build is mechanically identical to this one. The order they're in doesn't really matter, which makes the calculations a little more complicated, so let's break out the real math. This is a binomial coefficient. You might have learned it in school as NCR and CHOOSR, or simply the combination function. We can expand it into this formula with factorials and stuff, and basically what it means is that if you have a number of items and a number of slots, this is how many ways you can arrange them when repetition is not allowed and order doesn't matter. I'll be using this function a lot, but for right now we can plug in 37 and 2 to find that Jade has 666 options for equipping 1 or 2 auras. I wanted to make a joke about 666 and like the Stalker or something, but I couldn't figure it out, so just pretend I said something hilarious. Plus, that doesn't account for the situation where both slots are blank, so really she has 667. But since Jade works so differently than all the other Warframes, I'll put her to the side for now and we'll come back to her at the end. Now we're done with aura mods, but before we do the rest of the mods, I want to handle something else. Archon Shards. Do these count as a spoiler? Too late, I guess. These are items that you get from something, and then this thing can stick them in your Warframe for some permanent buffs. They come in 6 colors, each color has 2 tiers. These ones can give you any of 5 different effects, while these ones can give you 4, for a total of 54 options. You have 5 slots for them, and unlike with auras, you can equip duplicates. When you have a combination with repetition allowed, the basic form looks like this, but since each one can also be blank, we would add 1, which just cancels this part out. Plug in 54 for N and 5 for R, and we have 5 million arrangements of only Archon Shards. While we're talking about things Helminth does, I should call out specifically that I'm not doing invigorations, even though they are technically on the Warframe, just because they're temporary. On to proper mods. There are 102 of them that can go on Warframes, kind of, we'll come back to that, and 8 slots we can put them in. Duplicates aren't allowed, so we can start with another basic binomial coefficient, but we immediately run into a problem. Because, now that there are 8 possible blank slots, we can't just do this anymore. It was kind of a shortcut to begin with. And this one only worked because, when repetition is allowed, blank acts like any other option. But now, it's the only thing that can show up more than once. So now we have to account separately for each different number of possible blanks, which we can do using this. This is called a summation, it's what real sigmas use, and it means we take this number and for every value between here and here, inclusive, we evaluate this expression, plugging in everything in our range and then adding it all up. In order to figure out how the blanks affect our combination, we need a generalized formula. Let's call it a blank-inclusive combination, or CBINC for short. We can model it like this, so it iterates through every possible number of blanks between 0 and whatever R is, 8 in this case. Given the 102 mods, now we can plug that in and find 239 billion different configurations. There is another problem though. There's still one more slot, and the last one has different rules. This is the Exilus slot, and roughly 40% of our mods are Exilus Mods. They mostly do utility and movement stuff instead of stat changes. You can only equip Exilus Mods in the Exilus slot, but unlike auras, the Exilus Mods can also go in the normal slots, meaning we need another new formula. These are my functions, so I get to name them, and I'm calling this one the Partially Selection Exclusive Combination, or CSEX for short. Now we need 2 different Rs, one for normal slots and one for Exilus slots, and 2 different Ns separated the same way. We use our 2 sets of inputs in 2 independent combinations, one for our normal mods and one for our Exilus mods, but we have to iterate through both of them up to the number of normal slots. First, we do it where the only Exilus mod is in the designated slot, then we go through again, but this time there's one of them in a normal slot, then 2, then 3, and so on until the entire configuration is Exilus mods. We have 59 standard mods, 43 Exilus mods, 8 standard slots, and 1 Exilus slot, for a total of 2.28 trillion possible combinations using both types of mods. That doesn't include blanks, but we'll come back to those. It also doesn't include mod variants. Some mods come in multiple forms with modified stats. In the case of Warframe mods, they can come in 4 variants: Flawed, Primed, Umbral, and Archon. Flawed mods are weaker versions of standard mods, Primed mods are stronger versions, and Umbral and Archon mods are also stronger, but like, in a different way. Despite these 2 mods being different, and therefore these 2 builds being different, you cannot equip 2 variants of a mod in the same loadout, meaning we have to make another formula. If you're starting to get tired of these, I'm sorry, but there will be a lot more. First, let's lay out every mod in the list, categorize which ones have which variants, and then compile that into a table so we can tell how many groups of mutually exclusive mods we have, and how many are in each group. Then, we need to handle a few other mods that aren't technically variants of each other, but are still mutually exclusive, like the Archon sets, not to be confused with the Archon mods. Mechanically speaking, these behave as if they were variants, so we can categorize them the same way. And the same is true of these 8 Exilus mods, making our groups look something like this. All that settled, now we can construct our formula for the combination with mutual exclusivity, CMEX for short. This is where the math starts to get complicated, and so much in fact that initially I made a major mistake. Here's my original formula. We have one N value for every different number of variants a mod can have, and each N represents the number of groups of that size. This is a recursive definition where the formula itself gets longer the higher big K is, big K being the group size of the largest group. And also, for the 4 people who have really been waiting for set theory to show up, here it is. This is called set builder notation, and it's fancy math language for talking about what numbers are included, in this case for little k. This one means that little k must be a natural number and must be larger than 1 but smaller than big K. Altogether, it means if we have, let's say, big K equals 3, it would look like this, but if we had big K equals 4, it would look like this. Going back to big K equals 3 for simplicity, if we now plug in 4 for R, we can expand it into something like this. And while working on it, upon seeing this, I realized that this was a really dumb way to model it. It isn't wrong, but it is pretty inefficient, and that'll make it harder to get the final answer at the end. So let's rewrite it. But first, let's talk about this other new function, big pi. Big Pi works a lot like summation, but you multiply each iteration together instead of adding it. And it does have its own name, but it's just called a product, which is confusing since that's how most people talk about basic multiplication, so I'll stick with Big Pi. Looking back at our example, in expanded form, we can see that it's a bunch of terms all added together, and those terms are made of smaller ones that are all multiplied together. So, our new formula for CMEX should have a summation with Big Pi inside of it, something like this. You know you're doing real math when there's more Greek letters in your formula than there are numbers. This is post-number math. Most of this we've gone over already, but this summation is a little fancy. Instead of using a basic range with starting and stopping values, it runs through every set in a bigger set, and we define those sets with more set builder notation. In this case, we have every possible set of integers that add up to r, with this exception just in case we ever have fewer groups of a given size than we have slots. So, if big K is 3 and r is 4, like before, this will generate us this set of sets, and then our CMEX function will turn these back into this. Here's what it looks like if we plug everything in. If you're curious about all these zeros, that's the number of mods with 5, 6, or 7 variants. We never have any, but since we have one case with 8, we do still need to keep track of them to make the math work out. If we evaluate this, we have 2.07 trillion possible configurations. Although, now we're ignoring blanks and Exilus Mods, but I'll combine it all at the end for the final total. Up until now, outside of Jade, I've been completely ignoring exactly which Warframe we're using, and some people think that's a pretty important part of your build. That's because, up until now, it hasn't mattered. But before we can be done with the modding system, we have to talk about by far the most complicated part of it, the Augments. I mean complicated for this math, not for the game. In gameplay, Augments are nothing more than mods that only one Warframe can equip. They're usually attached to a specific power on that Warframe and modify that power, but not always. First, let's make a new list. Put our 62 Warframes here, keep track of which ones have primes for later, and list all the Augments they get. The first reason they're so complicated to handle is because the presence of these Augments means that not all Warframes have the same pool of mods to draw from. And on top of that, they don't even all have the same number of mods to choose from, because while some of them have no Augments, usually newer ones, most Warframes have at least 2 or 3. Older or popular ones often get 4 or 5, and Umbra and Loki both pull up with 6. At least he's first in something. The second reason that Augments complicate things is that some Warframes have multiple Augments that modify the same power, and when they do, those ones are mutually exclusive, meaning even the CMEX groups are different for different frames. So let's make a few more columns and track how many are attached to each ability. Of the 308 Augments currently available, a handful of them are Exilus Mods, so not even C-Sex gets away unchanged. Separating those out, we find these 13 Augments and that they belong to these 12 Warframes. But while this is the only time most of these frames will come up, we also have Mesa, Octavia, Saren, Titania, and Valkyr. And for the rest of the video, every time there's some kind of special exception that makes things a lot harder, these ladies and their Exilus Augments will be responsible. Let's do Titania first. Titania has an augment called Ironclad Flight. Despite affecting her Razorwing ability, it is not a Razorwing augment, and we can tell that because it isn't incompatible with the actual Razorwing augment, but it is incompatible with Aviator, a non-augment Exilus mod that does a similar thing. This is the only instance out of the 411 total Warframe mods that an augment is mutually exclusive with a non-augment. And while it doesn't change the formulas, it does complicate my spreadsheet. Also, side note, isn't this just worse than Aviator? The primary effect is the same, the secondary effect is a detriment, they both cost the same, and Xenoric is just a worse polarity than Vazarin. Plus, Titania already has a Vazarin slot by default. So what exactly is the purpose of this thing other than to bother me specifically? Real question, let me know if there is literally any situation where Ironclad Flight is better. Speaking of augments being mutually exclusive with things they shouldn't be, Saren's Spores and Valkyr's Hysteria both have 2 augments, but while one of each is a standard mod, the other one is an Exilus mod. These are the only 2 times this happens, and I have to ask, why? This completely breaks our logic for C-Sex and CMEX, and when I get around to combining those 2, these 4 mods, less than 1% of the total pool, are going to require 75% of the work to account for. But there are a few more things to cover before I combine everything, so all I can do about it right now is complain. What I can handle right now is the last reason augments are such a pain: Helminth abilities. Back to the Little Shop of Horrors, when he isn't shoving crystal shards in you, this guy can also transplant abilities from one Warframe onto other ones. Every frame can be subsumed to unlock a single predetermined ability of theirs. Some of these abilities have an augment, some have 2 augments, and Loki's back to show off his fancy 3-augment decoy. We also came so close to not having any Exilus Helminth augments, but Octavia just had to bring Conductive. When you use Helminth to transplant a new ability, you gain access to whatever augments the new ability has, but you lose access to the ones on the ability you replaced. And while that makes sense, you can't modify a power you don't have, it does mean the C-Mix groups for each Warframe are different not only based on the Warframe, and not only based on if you use Helminth and which ability you choose, but also which ability you replace. Meaning, there's over 32,000 different options between Warframe Choice and Helminth, and all of them slightly change which mods you can even use to begin with. So now we need a big chart. We can list our default groups for each frame here, and then because they'll all have slightly different numbers, we need to map out how many possibilities there are for each of the 4 powers that can be replaced. In addition to the ones from Warframes, Helminth offers 13 unique abilities. None of them have augments, but they are still options, so they go here. And also I'm separating out the 2 hybrid sets since we can't handle them yet. One last thing for now. There is one extra restriction on damage boosting abilities. Specifically that, when using Helminth, these 3 abilities cannot be put on these 7 Warframes unless the ability that they are replacing is one of these. For example, if we're giving a new power to Temple, there is 1 less option for 0 augment abilities and 2 less options for 1 augment abilities, except if we replace their 3rd ability. Then they have all the same options as everyone else. Since there aren't that many of them, the easiest way to handle these exceptions is to just manually add some -1s and -2s everywhere they apply. But if DE decides to expand this restriction system, it could be a huge problem. Here's the semi-final numbers, and keep in mind that these values are not counts of C-Mix groups. They are the number of different ways we can add a C-Mix group of these sizes to these numbers, but we can only pick 1 from these groups to add to these ones. Over here, we can compile what the counts change into based on how many augments the removed ability has and how many ones the added one does. Keep track of the number of different added abilities that do the same thing, and then sort out all possible unique values for each of our 8 C-Mix groups. Then, we could compile it into an even bigger sheet where we list each of the 6,048 possible combinations of those values with a big formula like this, count how many different ways each Warframe matches those values with an even bigger formula like this, and then total up how many times each set of C-Mix groups appears here. We could do all that, and I did it first in a brief bout of not thinking, but we probably shouldn't. Fun fact, if you write a 250-line formula that loops through data 200 times, and then try to make Google Sheets run that formula on 430,000 different cells, it doesn't process it very fast. So we should probably do something a little more streamlined. First, let's head back to the other sheet and replace these sets of 8 numbers with a single compiled string each, so we only have to compare 1 value. And, for no particular reason, let's format it like a Python array. Then, if we count all possible compiled strings, instead of all possible individual values, we can notice that even though there are 6,000 possible combinations, less than 200 of them actually appear in our dataset. So, if we only include those ones, and compare to the strings, we've gone from running a 250-line formula on 430,000 cells, to running a 25-line formula on 10,000 cells. Unfortunately, I am a professional software developer, meaning, like all developers, I am deathly allergic to optimizing my code. So after doing all that, I did need immediate medical attention. It does load a lot better now though. And by the way, like always, I will put my finalized spreadsheet in the description. But unlike the ones from some of my other videos, I'm not sure if this one will be very interesting or useful for anything other than checking my work. But it's still down there if you want it. That's pretty much everything regarding mods, so now we've got just a few relatively simple things left to cover. There's only one thing left that we equip directly on the Warframe, so let's start there. Arcanes add conditional effects that trigger buffs when you do something. There are 59 of them currently available, you can equip 2 of them, and they can't be the same one. Meaning we could go all the way back to using a simple combination, except we also have to deal with arcane helmets. Arcane helmets are helmets for specific Warframes that have stat buffs and debuffs, kinda like arcane augments. Other than a mistake in 2019, where you could buy this one in the Nightwave store, these have been unobtainable for over a decade, outside of trading with other players. But they are still in the game, and can still be equipped, and if you do equip them, they take up an arcane slot. Meaning technically, the number of arcanes you can pick from, like the number of mods, changes based on your Warframe. The helmets are old enough that not many Warframes have them. These ones all have 2, and Nova has 1. And since you can only equip 1 helmet at a time, all the frames that have 2 technically have a single case each of mutually exclusive arcanes. Meaning we have to handle arcanes using C-Mix, but since it relies on Warframe choice, we'll have to do it at the end with everything else. Next up, for Prime Warframes, we can add a new row right here and transpose the list of Primes from the other sheet. Then, since Primes will always have access to all the same stuff their non-Prime equivalents do, we can just double all the counts for all Warframes that have a Prime. Easy enough. And finally, the last component is something that I alluded to way at the beginning, because in a small handful of cases, your choices in fashion, specifically your emissive color, can change the game mechanically. By my count, there are 3-ish times this happens, but I couldn't find all of them in a compiled list anywhere, so I might be missing some. Let me know if I am. First up is Excalibur's Augment Chromatic Blade. It gives his Exalted Blade ability elemental damage based on your chosen color. That means, essentially, there are 4 different versions of this mod, and since you can't use more than one of them at the same time, we can handle it by just treating it like a group of 4 mutually exclusive augments. Next up is Equinox. She has 2 forms that she swaps between during missions, and which one she starts in is also determined by her emissive color. It's pretty minor, but that is a mechanical difference, so, similar to how we handled Chromatic Blade, we can count her as 2 separate, very similar Warframes, one that starts in day form, and one that starts in night form. All of her abilities also have 2 forms, including her Helminth ability, Rest and Rage, but when you put it on another Warframe, they can't swap between them. It's only determined by the color, so we can treat it as 2 different zero augment abilities. And then there's Chroma. Originally, this was his whole gimmick, and his color scheme would change his power set to match the chromatic dragon he's cosplaying as. But after his rework, now he can freely cycle between the 4 elements, and just like with Equinox, his emissive color just decides which one he starts with. And just like with Rest and Rage, any Warframe that gets his Helminth ability, Elemental Ward, has their color completely decide which element they use. So we can reuse both of our previous solutions, by counting Chroma as 4 Warframes, and counting Elemental Ward as 4 1-augment Helminth abilities. Now we've officially gone through everything that matters for a Warframe build, but we haven't gone over everywhere it matters, because we've only looked at PvE loadouts. In order to truly answer the question, we also need to investigate
the Conclave.
Conclave is Warframe's PvP game mode. It's largely ignored, both by players and by the developers, but it is there, and it does have Warframe builds, and they are different. It has its own loadouts that are separate from the PvE ones, and they feature a much simpler build system. No focus lenses, no Archon Shards, no Helminth, and no Arcanes. There's also a completely separate pool of Warframe mods that doesn't feature any variants, a smaller pool of Augments, and even a pretty small selection of Warframes to put it all on. The reason all that stuff is stripped away is partially for balance, but also because Conclave never gets any updates. That's why even though all the Warframes you can use have primes, you can't use all the primes, because DE just kinda never added them to the whitelist. There are some other changes, like the way some abilities work being different, but none of them will affect the math. Since all that stuff is missing, all we have to do is take our list of Warframes, sort out the ones that aren't available, and keep track of which primes are allowed. We have Exilus Mods, but not variants, and we have Augments, but nobody has more than one on the same power, meaning we only have to worry about these 2 groups. Also, we again came so very close to having 0 Exilus Augments, but this time Mesa ruined it. If we compile the arrays again, this time there's only 3 options. Then we can count how many times each one appears, multiply the ones that have primes by 2, multiply Equinox by 2, and multiply Chroma by 4. Finally, we have all of our data. Let's put everything in a new tab for easy reference. Put the ones for most Warframes in most situations here, the ones for Warframes with 2 auras here, and the ones for Conclave here. Now that we have all the raw data, we do still need to finalize our formulas. Right now, we have 3 separate ones for blanks, variants, and Exilus mods, plus we never properly handled Arcanes or those hybrid sets for Valkyr and Saren. C-Sex models Exilus mods, and C-Mex models variants, but if we want to handle builds with both simultaneously, we have to combine them. Luckily, that's pretty easy, because if we take the formula for C-Sex and replace the 2 normal combinations with C-Mex combinations, something like this, now we have a partially selection-exclusive combination with mutual exclusivity, or C-Sex-Mex. If we run through this formula once for each row of our inputs, it would account for Warframe choice, standard mods, Exilus mods, mod variants, Augments, Helminth, and the few times emissive color matters, so the bulk of our work is already done. To include Arcanes, we can just expand it. They have to be included in this since they're dependent on Warframe choice, but since they're independent of mods, we can just multiply the mod term by the Arcane term. There are no exclusive slots, but there are variants with the helmets, so we need to bring in another C-Mex. Now we can write out the equation for a partially selection-exclusive combination with mutual exclusivity and Arcane mutual exclusivity, C-Sex-Mex-A-Mex for short, like this. To deal with the possibility of blank slots for either Arcanes or mods, we wrote this equation earlier for C-Bink, and we can do pretty much the same thing now. The biggest difference is that now we have 3 different kinds of slots, and all of them can be blank, so we need to iterate through 3 separate times, like this. So now we've created the formula for the blank-inclusive partially selection-exclusive combination with mutual exclusivity and Arcane mutual exclusivity, or, in my increasingly inadequate abbreviation system, C-Sex-Mex-A-Mex-Bink. And then to deal with the hybrid sets, I could write a general form that handles any number of hybrid sets of any size, but that would require nested sets to handle the different counts and a multinomial coefficient to iterate through them. And that would be an insane amount of work and explanation just to handle the last 4 mods. So instead of doing that, since the number of hybrid sets is always 0 or 1, and since they're always size 2 with 1 of each kind of mod, we can cheat and use a piecewise function. If you've never seen or don't remember these, it literally just means if it's 0, we do this one, and if it's 1, we do this one. To fill the formula for the blank inclusive partially selection exclusive combination with mutual exclusivity and arcane mutual exclusivity, and also sometimes a hybrid set, we can do something like this, because in this case it's the same as before, and in this one the augments from the hybrid set will either take up no slots, 1 regular slot, or 1 Exilus slot. This is our final formula. If you're curious, this is what it looks like in full if we don't define it using the other ones. Now that we have this, and all the inputs, it's time to make a computer do it. For each row of the inputs, we'll run through the final formula and then multiply it by this first value, which is how many different ways we can get these same numbers. That still doesn't include focus lenses, ores, or Archon Shards, but since all of those are fully independent, we can just multiply the results by the counts we got for them earlier. For Jade, swap out 37 ores for 667 aura combinations, and then for
the Conclave,
all we need is a simple CMEX. Add it all together, and we have the final result. The true total number of ways that you can build a Warframe is 9 nonillion, 664 octillion, 927 septillion, 653 sextillion, 407 quintillion, 925 quadrillion, 229 trillion, 311 billion, 907 million, 841,806. There aren't any units on that number, since it's a quantity, but I think that's lame. So, in more understandable units, that's 27.8 sextillion times the population of the United States, 16.2 quadrillion times the ratio between the amount Steve can lift and the amount the Terrarian can, 2.76 quadrillion times the number of pennies needed to pay off the national debt of the United States, 3.92 octillion times the number of polygons that form the rear end of the Ember heirloom skin, 377 trillion times the number of Diplococcus bacteria that fit in a 2001 Toyota Corolla, 1.73 septillion times the number of ringtails that fit in the Taj Mahal, 3.45 octillion times the number of observable universes that fit in the Super Topa Tengen Gurren Lagann, and 32.2 times the number of protons in a 2005 Hyundai Elantra. Like I said before, that is only one part of the total number of configurations, since I didn't cover weapons or companions. I didn't have time to include or even finish the formulas for that stuff, since the math gets even more complicated. But if this video does well, I'd love to do a part 2. Let me know if you're interested. While you're down there, don't forget to like the video, come say hi on Discord if you want to chat, and tell me in the comments what your favorite Warframe is. You'll never guess mine. And in the meantime, just know, when you build your Warframe, you've got a few options. And stay nice, everyone.